My main concern was getting hand depth by getting rotation. And when do I say, okay, that hand depth is actually hurting you? Because with one of the swings previously, we talked about how his hands got way too deep and he had to rotate way too much to get the club out in front of him. And then, okay, so then when is getting the hands up high a bad thing as well?
Okay. Okay. I'm going to bring in a couple of examples of different players.
Perfect.
I'm just going to pull them up on my skill list and we'll go through them together.
Absolutely.
Okay. So I'll start it off by saying this. If there is a player, the only scenarios in which I will remove depth from a player's top of backswing, because there's not a million scenarios in which you would want to do that necessarily. First of all, the average golfer is too steep on the ball. Odds are they can afford to have more, way more often than they need to have less. Let's be realistic, right? So
absolutely.
There are times in which I would certainly remove some. I would say that predominantly, even regardless of what the pattern is, it's usually for the better player that we're going to make that kind of adjustment. Usually it's in scenarios where the player is too shallow on the ball, and removing hand depth obviously creates some steepening effects, which will prevent them from swinging too far from the inside. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Right.
Absolutely.
So those are the kinds of scenarios where we would want to remove hand depth. Now, I don't go that route unless one of two things is taking place. Either the golfer already has some level of good rotation through the golf ball already.
Right. Yep.
Or I would say one of three examples. The first example would be golfer already rotates well. So at some point, you can only use rotation so much to offset how shallow the club gets. And right. And so if the club is coming down very shallow and the golfer is already rotating very well, well, you can't get them to spin out of their shoes even more than they're already doing. At some point, you just can't rely on that. And the truth is, we wake up with different physical feelings every day. Some days you're tight, some days you're not. You can't rely on having to do such a severe amount of rotation just to make sure the ball goes straight, because you can't rely on that every day. That's just the reality of it. In that situation, you need to find another way to try to prevent the club from coming down on too steep of a plane. Does that make sense? Or to prevent them from coming down on too shallow of a plane. Too shallow of a plane. Yes, my apologies. And in that situation, that's when I would try to create less hand depth in the backswing, because now you're getting the hands more in front of the body and you're getting the club more in front of the body without altering the pivot, because the pivot already is pretty good, let's say, in that scenario.
Yep, absolutely.
Right? That would be one case. Golfer already rotates well. The club is coming down too shallow. You can't use rotation anymore because the golfer is rotating as well as they probably could. At some point, you need to find an alternative method. I would never tell a golfer, hey, take this club and do this to not be so shallow. That's usually a nightmare. The golfer doesn't know how much to feel that. They usually overdo it really fast. They'll get too steep. It's just not ideal. So you need to find a way to get them less shallow without them overdoing it really quick. And that feel usually overdoes it really quick.
Yep.
That's when I would remove hand depth from a player. And again, this is only under the assumption that the golfer doesn't then also react from your change. Meaning, the way I want you to start looking at swing changes is, if all else remains equal, but this variable is changed to here, then the resulting effect will be so and so and so. Meaning, if my hands are very flat and way too deep, and my hands are stuck here, and the club is coming down too shallow, and I'm already rotating well, but the club is like still way too shallow.
Right.
And the assumption is, if I take this position and I get the hands up, the hands come down naturally more on plane or in front of the golfer. The club comes down more on plane. The path straightens out through that change, assuming the golfer doesn't react. I would say that every now and again, and it is rare for the most part, but it certainly does happen, you will fall into scenarios where a golfer has such good awareness about what they're doing that they will really strongly react to the change you're making, because that change that we just spoke about makes sense in theory, assuming that everything else remains constant, right?
Yep.
There will be a case where a golfer might get the hands, let's say, more out and up in the backswing. And I'll go through a scenario where I did that with a player. And then it's like, hey, that felt really uncomfortable. Yep. And guess what I'm going to do now? I'm going to reroute the crap out of the hands coming down, right?
Yep. Oh, yeah.
So
yep.
That doesn't happen all the time, but it does happen. And to be honest, you can see the inverse issue happen with really bad golfers as well, which is where your hands are really high. We try to get the hands deeper, again, under the assumption that all else remains constant. If the hands get deeper, I can swing more shallow from the inside. But now the golfer feels super pinned across their body and super stuck. And guess what they do in transition? Yeah. Right? And it becomes this like nightmare. Now, obviously, you can't predict that in advance. Every single time you're going to make that kind of change, you're going to hope that that's not the reality of what's going to happen with the student, but it might happen every so often. If it does happen, you need to find an alternative method to correct your problem.
Right. Okay.
Okay. Now, either that means you can feel it even more extreme. So even if they reroute it, it's not as stuck behind them. It can be really, really extreme. Right. I have done that with some players before, and I'll actually pull up a player that I think I'm posting the voiceover of today about a very similar tendency that he has. Mm-hmm. But you always have to think of a swing change when you're dealing with a player before that kind of reaction exists. You have to assume that reaction won't exist. And in an ideal scenario, obviously it won't, right? Yep. So what the first option would be, golfer's already rotating well, club is too shallow, you can't do it with rotation, you change hand depth.
Yep.
The second scenario would be if the golfer cannot physically rotate well, even if they're already not rotating. Meaning, if I get my hands flatter, but I'm an older golfer or I'm someone with some sort of physical limitation, I can't even rotate as well as I used to. I have a torn ACL in my left knee. I have a herniated disc in my lower back. Like, my body's not the same as it was when I'm 20, unfortunately. I'm in good shape, but I can't support it with so much stress on my body every single time. Sure. Yep. So the problem is, if I get my arms too flat, I know my hands are going to drop some amount because I just can't go with my body. I have some level of mobility concerns there, let's say, right?
Yeah, I think there was an example on your Instagram.
Yeah, so in that situation, I just can't afford to have my hands be too flat or on the deeper side, because I will never be able to get my hands working in front of me consistently because I cannot physically turn my body. So golfers who are lacking in physical ability to rotate, in that situation, you're very likely better off having less depth as opposed to more, because having less will facilitate bringing the club coming down on a steeper plane. And if I can't rotate, I'm better off being steeper than I am being shallower. Obviously, there's a range of acceptable areas. I don't want them to be too steep, but I certainly don't want them to be on the shallow side of the spectrum, because they'll always be stuck in the downswing if they can't rotate well.
Yeah, I have an example of a gentleman who's very shallow, and he has lots of trouble with heel strikes, shanks, big, huge draws. So that's one of the first people where I was like, okay, yeah, we need to get you up a little bit more. But there was also another example that you had that on your Instagram of an older gentleman who you explained not everybody needs to get a deeper turn because he can't rotate as well as he used to be able to.
100%. So I'll show you two examples here, one of which actually I might have posted him today or yesterday, ironically enough. But this golfer rotates pretty good as it is, okay, but continues to get too shallow on the golf ball. And he tells me, like, hey, I'm trying to rotate my best. I'm always feeling like I can only go so far with how fast my chest is opening and whatever, but I continue to get stuck too far from the inside. And when you look closer at the swing, you'll realize it's much more of a hand depth issue than it is any sort of pivot issue. So check this out here, okay? So this golfer's name is Martin. He's been working with me online for about 2-3 months.
Gotcha.
You're going to see that Club work's a little inside. It's not a crazy amount.
No.
But his arms are certainly on the deeper end of the spectrum at this point. They're much more across his body, which,
Yep.
hey, you take a golfer who's like too steep on the ball, you get them this type of takeaway and backswing, he's likely going to hit some nice draws and be really happy about it. Right?
Right. Yep.
But there comes a point where you can get the arms really, really far behind your body. And it was actually worse than this. This is after like a month of working on it. So
Okay.
his arms now are super far behind the heels of the feet. His arms are super stretched back. You can even see like how much external rotation his right arm is in, like how far back and bent his elbow is in this position, as opposed to like being straighter like this. You can see how far back. As soon as you see this forearm work really, really far this way, you can have an assumption that the hands are getting very deep, obviously, for me to stretch this trail arm in that position. Okay.
Okay. I gotcha.
So you can kind of see that right there. So there comes a point where like, hey, he's rotating really good. Like his hips get pretty much back to square almost by P5, which is very good for rotational players. Like you wouldn't want his hips to be spun out at this point. He gets he gets his chest almost back to square by this point. Like he's clearly rotating really good. Like there's only so much rotation this guy can do. He's actually staying in his tilts really well as well. His left shoulder is not too high at this point. His left hip is not too high at this point. So we're looking tilts as well, which is going to follow up into the next conversation we're going to have about downswing pivot stuff. Okay. But yet his club is still coming so far from behind his hands. So by the time he gets down into this golf ball, he's still really far from the inside. And it's not like he's over rotating his body. Like the sequence of the rotation was pretty good.
Yeah, it was.
But yet he hits a lot of blocks and hits a lot of pull draws all the time.
Yep.
Continues to fall into that trap and like pretty good rotation through the ball here, pretty good exit through the ball here. His shoulder plane is pretty good. Like by all accounts, this guy shouldn't be stuck with how well he's rotating.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
So when we're looking at
So
when we're looking at hand depth, it's kind of like an X and Y axis, right? So if up at the top we've got X and it just keeps moving farther and farther away from the center, that's deeper and deeper. And then up high, would you call that more shallow or just higher hands?
So there's two things you can consider, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Both of those things will affect the level of depth the player has at any given point coming down into the ball. It's not just one axis that is your depth, it's the up and the down. Okay. And I'll give you an example why, but I want to use a skill list here for a second so that I can actually draw some lines out, because I'm going to give you a really good visual on this.
Absolutely.
Because I believe this part is very, very important as well. Let's just pull this up here. Here's the last swing that he had that I just sent him an analysis back literally this morning. So here's the updated videos. So just to give you an idea, this was the new version.
Oh, that looks nice.
Hands are not nearly as far behind him by P3, right?
Yep.
Hands are way taller at the top and not nearly as far behind his body here at this point.
Yep.
I might be able to actually change the way we see this. Give me a second. Let me see if I can get that. Oh, no, that was it. Okay. Coming down, look how much more in front of him his hands get by P5. And we didn't say anything about his downswing. Like we purely just changed this from getting his hands higher in the backswing. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Remember how his club was behind his thigh at that point?
Yep. Now it's getting right there.
It's a little blurry, but you can see it's like kind of right in this position here.
Yep.
And so coming down now into the golf ball, how much straighter is that into the ball now with its path than it was before?
Yeah.
We never mentioned anything about his body because his body already rotates well. At some point, you can only rely on the rotation of the body so much. His club actually exits very similar to it did before because his pivot hasn't really changed.
Gotcha. Okay.
Right? If I change the way my body's going to move through the ball, you'll see a difference in the release because you'll see a difference in where the hands are going. But his hands are in similar positions through impact. They really changed where they are at the top and coming down, which is what changed the plane of his club. Does that make sense?
Yep, absolutely.
Okay. So let's say you take a golfer whose hands are here. You take another golfer whose hands are here. You take another golfer whose hands are here. 3 different examples.
Yep.
If their pivot is the same, you can assume the sequence of how outward the hands move in transition will be the same for all 3 golfers. Does that make sense? So
No.
Okay. So I'll clarify this part because I don't want it to be confusing. Okay.
Yep.
If my body moves a certain way, my hands will have some amount of down and some amount of outward motion in the downswing.
Yep.
So let's say they're always moving outward at a 30-degree angle.
Sure.
Well, if my body moves the same, just because my hands are here, they shouldn't move outward at a different position. They'll move out at a 30-degree angle as well. The starting point is different, so the positioning coming down is different, but the amount of down versus out the golfer has should be pretty consistent if the golfer is moving the same way, regardless where the hands are.
Okay. Yep. Yeah. So in other words, they're not doing something like that in change to the swing.
Exactly. So assuming that my body moves the exact same way in all 3 scenarios, and my hands are in 3 different positions, the 3 different positions shouldn't necessarily change what direction the hands move outward starting down. Meaning,
I gotcha.
If I'm here and I move my body the same way as a golfer who's here, we'll hit different positions in the downswing, but it's not like this golfer is going to move them more out and this golfer is going to move them more down. They'll move in a very similar direction on each one.
Gotcha. Yep.
Does that clarify it?
Yes, it does. Yep.
Okay. So again, this is always under the assumption that the golfer is not reacting when you're making a change, right? Like the assumption is that the golfer will move their body the exact same way.
Yeah. Yeah. Like, for example, when you try to get some students' hands higher, they'll tend to start tilting back.
And they might do a backswing change to affect that, or they might get them taller and do a downswing change because it feels weird.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah.
So let's assume that there's no external reactions from the player, because that's always the mindset you need to have when you're making an adjustment. If there is a reaction, you can either keep it and manage it and deal with it, or you find an alternative field that maybe doesn't give you that reaction that the player gave you.
Yep. Absolutely.
Make sense?
Yep.
Okay. So let's even make this more simple. Let's get rid of this example, the third one. 2 golfers, the sequence of how outward the hands go is the same on both ones, meaning the body didn't move any differently. Okay.
Yep.
In theory, the level of hand depth relative to how far behind the body and how far behind the golf ball these 2 hands are is quite similar, are they not?
Yes. Yes, they are.
I haven't gotten one further back than the other.
Right. Yeah, they're about the same.
They're about the same. But the golfer whose hands are higher, are they not getting more in front of his body than the other one?
Yes.
Right?
Right.
One golfer's hands get here, the other golfer's hands get here. Yeah. Meaning, if there is a club head that is also moving with this golfer's hands, let's say in scenario 1, the club head is here. In scenario 2, I'll recreate a similar relationship. The club head is here. Okay. So this is hands of golfer 1. This is club head of golfer 1. This is hands of club head golfer 2. This is club head of golfer 2. Right?
Absolutely. Yep.
Well, if the hands move outward the exact same amount, by the time the hands get here for scenario 1, they'll be here for scenario 2. By the time that position happens, then the club head will be here for scenario 1. They'll be here for scenario 2.
Okay.
So far, the relationship is identical for both, let's say. Does this make sense so far?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
The golfer whose hands are lower, is the club head not swinging more from the inside and under the plane?
Yes. So that was going to be my follow-up question is, okay, so more in front of the body when you say that, they're coming through a little bit higher up that chest and sternum area, and more behind is coming down more through, let's say, the hips in this scenario.
Yes, exactly. So all else equal in how the body's moving from golfer 1 to golfer 2, having the hands higher, even if you don't alter the depth, will get the club coming down on a plane that is more in front of their body.
Okay, I gotcha.
This is why I say getting the hands up can get the club coming down on a more vertical plane, even if you don't alter the depth. You can also alter the depth and it'll have a very similar reaction, but you can keep the hands in the exact same spot, but just raise them. And even if the depth doesn't get more back or more up front, it just goes straight up. The plane of the club will come down more in front of the body.
I gotcha. Yes, that makes a whole lot more sense, because you don't want them to start turning and get their hands here to remove some of the depth and then them start coming more outside. Instead, getting them here from to here, that will help them out a lot more.
Well, it's just, you have the ability to change the actual depth of how far in front of them versus how far behind them they are. But the problem is, if you remove too much depth, they can get really steep on it, right? Yeah. And obviously, if you add too much, they can get really shallow on it. It's not a guarantee, but it just makes it easier for both scenarios.
Yep. Okay, I got you.
So just keeping the arm plane kind of where it is in terms of where the hands are in line with the feet, but raising them is a really easy way. Look how I'm just tracing this mirror behind me right now, right? So I'm now standing here. My hands are on top of them, right at the edge of the mirror. I'm not bringing the hands here to remove hand depth, but I'm getting the hands taller and tracing this mirror. Well, I'm just bringing them straight up. Well, the plane of my arms looks a lot taller now. It looks more upright, right? So it's really the arm plane that I'm affecting here when I raise or lower the hands. And when I get the hands up, even if I don't actually change the actual physical positioning of the depth, well, the hands will be more in front of me coming down, assuming the sequence of the hands are the exact same.
Yep, absolutely. Makes a whole ton of sense now.
Right? So that's what I did with that particular player there, which is where I'm getting the golfer to not have the hands be here, but rather be there. In theory, I could have gotten the hands here and actually removed depth. And if anything, I just would have compounded that change even further. Like I would have added to it more. But the way I always like to do it is when I'm making a change with a player, and I find that every coach should kind of trace this idea a lot. You never want to be that guy who goes too far with the change too fast with the player and then has to scale back on it.
Yeah, then you look like an idiot.
And you know what? Even if you don't look like an idiot, you don't want to be the guy who's bouncing back and forth with ideas too much. Because then the player is like, oh my God, well, now you're telling me to do something, but now you're telling me I'm doing it too much. How can I only feel it some amount? I can either feel it or not feel it. Right? Yeah. Most players, especially the higher handicappers you're going to deal with, they don't have great awareness. They don't know what they're feeling. They're just trying to feel something different. They can't control the severity of how much they're feeling it different. Right? A good player might be able to. A bad player doesn't really have that skill or that awareness a lot of times. So you just need them to feel something that's different to what they're doing. But if you tell them like, hey, feel this, but oh, hey, this is too much, feel it, but feel it less, they're going to be like, what? How am I supposed to do that?
Yeah.
Right? So in these scenarios, you want to make a change to the player, but you want to make them incrementally, meaning you always want to make a change that still gives you room to do more if necessary, but you don't want to go from 0 to 100 and then have to scale back to 60 afterwards.
Yep, I got it.
So in this case, you have the hands that are in a certain position. If I raise them up, I get the plane of the club working better. If it's not enough, then I can start to actually alter how far in front of me versus how far behind me they are.
I gotcha. Okay.
Now you have room to even do it further if necessary, but you're still making a change by doing this before going to there. Does that make sense?
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay. So this is how I would look at hand depth. But again, these types of changes, you don't make them that often. You're rarely going to take a guy who's slicing the ball and doing that. Now, it does happen every now and again. Keep in mind where you might have a higher handicapper who gets super deep and then gets stuck and then does a crazy amount of this in transition. You might have to actually flip the script on how the arm plane is traveling and the hands are traveling. So you might need to get them to feel taller, but then you have to reroute them coming down. But in that scenario, you're not just making a backswing change and hoping for the best. You have to actively work with that player on rerouting the hands differently to what they're doing, right? So that's kind of a different situation. But on this particular player, he's here, he's just getting stuck. All you got to do is get his hands up under the assumption his body is already moving well. If his body's not moving well, you have some space to get the body rotating better. That can help him have his hand path work more outward, which might help him if necessary. Like, let's say there's a golfer who they gets their arm playing very deep, but they don't rotate well, and they just tilt back and stay behind it, and now the hands drop even more, and now they're really in trouble.
Yep.
Does that make sense?
Yep. Yes,
in that situation, I would start it off by getting them to rotate better to fix some of the shallowing troubles they have that they're too stuck.
Yep.
If it fixes part of the problem and not all of the problem, then as a secondary adjustment, you can get the hands higher afterwards. But you will gain a lot more from fixing the pivot first, because number one, you'll get the hands more in front of the body anyways, even if it's just a small amount. Number two, with rotation comes more passive hands. With rotation comes better low point control, right? You're not flipping and stalling and doing all these crazy things with the hands. Yeah. So there are other benefits you can gain from rotation beyond just trying to prevent the club from being too shallow. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yes, it does.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So because you can fix multiple areas with rotation beyond just the plane of the club, I would do that first, because that will still help you with the golfer not being too shallow into the ball.
Yes. Yep.
Once you do that, it might not fix all the problems with that player, because maybe they were just so stuck that, like, hey, I can get you to rotate to maybe get a little less stuck, but you're still kind of too shallow coming into the ball. In that scenario, then you can manipulate this situation here to fix the rest of the problem.
Yep. I got you. Yep.
If a golfer comes to you and you have your typical questions you're going to ask them at the beginning of the first session ever with them, that you're learning about their game and their history, and you're communicating back and forth, and it's like he tells you, hey, by the way, I've had 3 hip surgeries and my back is kind of fucked, and you know, I for me to try to rotate through the golf ball is going to be a big fat 0. Like, it ain't happening. Well, if you see them getting their hands super far back here and they're super stuck and shallow from the inside, it's like, hey, buddy, that is not working. It doesn't matter. Even if their arm plane isn't overly deep, if they still tilt back and they're always going to tilt back and stay behind it because they can't turn, well, then that position there doesn't work for them. You still need to get them taller. Keep in mind, sometimes the arm plane isn't even that far behind them and you need to get it even taller. Like, it does happen if the golfer is always going to stay behind it and they can't do anything about it.
I got you.
If they're giving you a physical restriction and they're saying, hey, this downswing movement that I have with my body has been there for 25 years and I have surgeries and it ain't going to get ever any better, you can either do one of two things. You can work with it and just even alter the hand depth further if necessary, which is what we're talking about. Or you can maybe try to alter the way the body's moving. And the reason I say this is because sometimes a player will tell you, I have this sort of physical injury, this sort of physical limitation, or whatever, but they have never really learned the correct feel to improve it, right? And they're just assuming that they can't do it.
Yeah.
And it does happen. Sometimes a player comes to you and they're like, hey, I've tried to shallow the club. I will never be a shallower of the golf ball. It doesn't work. I've tried every feel in the book. And you're like, okay, just make a bigger turn and get your hands deeper. And all of a sudden they're shallow. And they're like, what? Like, how did that get better? You know, like, they were lacking in the understanding, which you can't blame them. It's not their job to know, right? Their job is to play golf. Their job is not to understand swing mechanics. So sometimes you might give them a feel that they haven't tried before that actually gets their body working a little better. Or you could just deal with it and accept that that's going to be the case, and then you alter the, the hand depth, and that's possible. I'm not telling you what to do. I'm just telling you, like, don't always take information that a player will give you in a lesson with like 100% like clear cut, like this is an absolute. Take it with a grain of salt, because sometimes it's right. Sometimes they just haven't found the right feel or the right swing change to actually make the adjustment they're struggling with.
Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely.
So far, so good?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Got it.
Nice. So I'm going to bring in another player, and this is a player where his hands used to be very stuck, and then he started to get them a little higher, and then they started to reroute really far to the inside, and then we started to get them higher, and then they started to reroute to the inside, and then we got him to a place where he had to look like Bubba at the top of his backswing just to get everything working down in front of his body. He used to have the hands very deep. They used to lower a lot. He rotates a crazy amount, so you can't work on rotation necessarily. So then I got them up. Then he would reroute them to the inside again. Then I got them up. Then we rerouted him to the inside again. And then I had to get him to literally do this because that was the one option we had to get him coming down on a better plane. I actually have the swing in my phone. I don't know why I'm waiting for Skillest to load here. My apologies on that.
No worries.
Yeah, here. I've posted about this guy a bunch. You'll see the swing and you'll be like, yeah, I know this dude.
I think I might already have an idea.
Oh man, this video uploaded at an angle. I don't know why every time I upload swings to my computer, for whatever reason, they decided to just upload them at a 90-degree angle sideways. I don't know if that's
good.
An issue with YouTube, but I just need to resave the video from an Instagram story and then I upload it and then problems are solved.
Yep, no worries.
Here. Yeah, I have a feeling you're going to know exactly who this is too, if I'm being completely honest.
I think I really do have a good idea because I saw it and I was like, whoa. I was like, those hands are high.
You think of this guy?
Yep.
Brian. Brian's a great golfer. So Brian first came to me on Skillest, I want to say back in maybe 2018. Okay. He is a great coach in his own right. He works out of a facility in Boston or like near Boston, let's say in Massachusetts, called Pure Drive. If you've ever seen Adam Koloff runs the facility. Brian's one of his instructors at the facility. So they all and then once I started working with him on Skillest, he used to do the drive down to come and see me like every couple of months. And so we also did a mix of in-person and online. But
gotcha.
Brian's got the hands, obviously, I mean, like upright. These are way up above his head. And they're not very far behind him. So he's got the magic combination of like not only no depth, but also a lot of height to the hands.
Yep.
So by all accounts, he should be super steep into that golf ball for most players from that position. You give most high handicappers this position, they're going to never find their way back to the ball with any sort of straight path into it. Right?
Right. Yeah. Yep.
His hands look like they're really far out in front of him at this point. What you don't see is the sequence of how his hands move. So this is another conversation I want to have with you. It is not always just about a still image of saying the hands are here and they need to be here, or the hands are here and they need to be there. It's also what you can't see on a picture, which is the direction the hands are going. That is very important. And I'll give you an example. Okay. Two golfers are coming into the golf ball. I'm going to place myself in a P5 position. One golfer's hands are here. One golfer's hands are back here. This guy obviously looks a lot more stuck, right?
Yes. Yeah.
By all accounts, this golfer should be more from the inside of the golf ball.
That's correct. Yeah. If you're just looking at those two.
Just looking at those two images at that point. What if this golfer here has the hands lowering into the golf ball here, meaning I'm here, but my hands are lowering and this club is getting more behind me because my forearms are rotating and the hands are dropping and I'm super close to my body. And you couldn't see that in the photo because they looked way out in front of me, but you don't see how everything is moving beyond that point. Versus the golfer who's here, and what you didn't see is he's actually doing this into the golf ball. His hands are working really out and the club's working really out. And let's say this golfer's here, he's way steeper at this point, but the hands are working in and the club is working behind him with some forearm rotation there.
Right. Got it.
Unfortunately, people really like to obsess over analyzing photos. I get DMs literally every week and someone sends me a picture into the downswing and they're like, hey, does this look good? You know what I tell them? I don't have a clue. And I'm not lying to them. I genuinely don't have an idea because I don't see the sequence of movements. We spoke about it before. What if my hands are here and the golfer's hands drop versus the hands are here and the golfer's hands work out? They're going to have two very different downswings, even though their backswing was in the same position. Like you just don't know, right? Yep. So when you have a guy like this, by all accounts, it looks like he's going to be way too steep into that ball because he's got no hand depth at P5 here. His hands are way out on top of his toes. They're way out in front of him. He looks like he's going to be really steep on it, right? If you just took this image. But what you don't see is the club is rerouting inside and his hands have a much more vertical sequence to them than an outward horizontal sequence to them. They don't work out very much. His hands drop a ton. They move very vertically downwards. So because his hands worked vertically downwards, he is matched up better by having much less depth at the top of his backswing.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Yep. Absolutely.
Right? So if you took this exact same golfer, but his hands were more behind him into what looks like a more neutral plane of the arms, something that looks perfect by all accounts, looks like a perfect backswing. And his hands do the exact same sequence that they do now, what would happen to him?
He would get so stuck and behind him, right?
You would have no shot of playing good golf.
No.
So
no
he
chance.
needs one of two things if that was his situation. He would either need to get the hands working outward more, right?
Okay.
Which can be done with rotation, or he needs to just have his starting point be much more upright.
So in this scenario, he already has good rotation, so his hands still drop, right? I'm assuming he had good rotation previously. So then you work his hands more up. So that way, as he has that good rotation, he's got space to move that club.
There you go. That's the exact combination. So when you're looking at a golfer's hand depth, you can't just look at the hand depth the player has. You have to look at that relative to the movements of the body.
Okay.
Because if the hands are dropping, but the golfer is not rotating well, you have space to rotate better to work the hands more out. But if the hands are dropping, and you just said it, the golfer's already rotating well, you don't want him to try to manufacture some outward hand path that's going to feel super weird and uncomfortable to him. He just won't do it. You need to try to get those hands working outward organically through the rotation, if possible. If he's already rotating, like you just mentioned, you just get the hands up.
Yeah. Seems simple after you talk about it, right?
But does it make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So when you're looking at how the hands are working coming down into the ball, if they need to change, first look at how the body's moving to see what your best options are. You combine those two pieces together, you can make a more informed decision on if I need to alter the hands, or I need to alter the body, or I need to alter both, but one after the other, or however you want to go through that process with the player. And obviously, physical ability of the golfer itself makes a big difference as well in your decisions.
Absolutely.
So in this case, his hands are super upright, right?
Yep. Very upright.
Not only does he rotate like crazy, but his hands drop a lot. They still look like he's going to get really steep on the ball if you just took a still image of this, but his hands continue to lower and not work too out. His club continues to get shallow, and lo and behold, he's in virtually a perfect position for a golfer who just wants to keep rotating and not be stuck.
Yep.
Keep in mind, he has an absurd amount of rotation too. Like, this golfer is incredibly mobile and flexible to get into this position. Most people will not have the ability to get there. Let's be real, right?
Yeah. Not only with the rotation, but the way that the club can come behind him as well is very unusual.
From you to be so upright, but then not only be able to get the club shallowing in general from such an upright position, which is already a big task for most people, but then to also rotate and not have his hands get too far out in front of him is like a mind-boggling matchup that you rarely see.
Yeah.
But when you understand matchups and you understand how those pieces work together, you can understand how he's actually really functional from that position and those movements.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay. All of a sudden, he continues to rotate. I mean, what's wrong with that?
Nothing. I want some of that.
You're not the only one. I can assure you I need some of this in my own swing too. So
absolutely.
He likes to draw it. So his preference is to have the club head a little bit inside. He likes to play a draw. That's fine. He likes to play a cut. Sometimes that's fine. But having the club head be here is not terrible. He's not too stuck. And he rotates certainly enough to support it. But could you imagine if he had his hands dropping that much from a slightly deeper position, even with that rotation? He'd be in no man's land. He would snap hook everything. And to be honest, when his swing gets into trouble, he does tend to get too shallow and he gets a little too stuck behind him and everything just gets super like.
Yeah, you just get too much curve or too much block. I've experienced that quite a bit. Sweet.
Yeah. So that's a very particular situation, but a situation that is not as complex as it sounds like it is when you just understand where you have the ability to make changes within that player's movement pattern.
Right. Yeah. It's about combining the hands, how the body's moving, if their hands drop, if their hands work out, and then being able to kind of adjust them into that scenario, all else being equal.
Exactly. There are some golfers, to be honest, where you have their hands be too tall. You tell them to make a bigger turn. They get the hands working more behind their body. The club comes down slightly more shallow, and it's like the easiest fix in the world. I know you had sent me a message about this too. Like, these are arguably the easiest golfers, in my opinion, to change. You have a very obvious problem of the arm plane being too very upright. It's always going to be difficult to get the club coming from the inside or not being too steep or too slicey with the ball from that position for most higher handicappers. Usually they restrict their hip turn either because of a lack of understanding or because of some poor information on the internet of like keeping your right knee bent and trying to restrict your curve, right?
Yeah.
You know, how often does a golfer come to you and like just trying to figure out their intent, you can figure out the problem. You're like, oh yeah, I saw this video on YouTube of keeping my right knee bent and creating coil and, you know, trying to rotate my body. You're like, dude, you're doing yourself a massive disservice. You're going to make it so easy. You're going to come down steep on the ball.
Yeah, because once you restrict hip turn, you're going to restrict the chest, and then your arm's going to work up, and you're just bad.
Everything's going to be stuck every single time. Same problem.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So if the golfer's arm plane looks pretty good at the top and the club is shallowing really well, but the golfer is not rotating, there's your easy fix. Don't alter the hand depth in that position unless the golfer can turn, obviously. Just get them pivoting better in.